January 17, 1943, Burma India Theatre, 22,000 feet above the Arakan Hills. The air is thin and cold. The cockpit reeks of engine oil and sweat. Below, the jade-green canopy of the Burmese jungle stretches endlessly, broken only by silver threads of rivers winding through valleys that have no names on American maps. Inside the cramped fuselage of a P-40 Warhawk, Captain James Howard's hands grip the control stick with a peculiar steadiness, the kind that comes not from confidence, but from having nothing left to lose. His squadron is gone, scattered like leaves in a typhoon. 37 Japanese fighters swarm the sky around him, their red meatball insignias glinting in the tropical sun like predators' eyes. The radio crackles with static and distant screams. He is alone, but James Howard is not afraid. He is thinking about rejection. 2 years earlier, Howard had been a promising Navy pilot candidate, standing tall in his dress whites, dreaming of carrier decks and Pacific glory. The medical board took one look at his records, a childhood injury, a minor vision discrepancy, and stamped his file with a single word: unfit. The Navy didn't want him. They said his reflexes were average. They said he lacked the killer instinct. They said he would be a liability in combat. So James Howard did what rejected men often do when their country won't have them. He went to another country's war. In 1941, he joined the Flying Tigers, Claire Chennault's ragtag band of American mercenaries fighting for China against the Japanese onslaught. He flew obsolete aircraft over impossible terrain for pay that barely covered his whiskey. The Navy had called him unfit. The Flying Tigers called him Lucky Jim, though luck had nothing to do with it. By January 1943, Howard had transferred to the United States Army Air Forces, now wearing the uniform of the country that once rejected him. He was assigned to the China-Burma India Theatre, where the war was not glamorous. It was a grinding malarial hell of supply shortages, monsoon rains, and an enemy that fought with fanatical precision. The Japanese Army Air Force pilots were not the green recruits of Hollywood imagination. They were veterans of Manchuria, China, the Philippines, men who had been killing in the sky since before most American boys knew how to shave. Their Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters were lighter, more maneuverable, capable of turns that would tear the wings off a P-40. American pilots called them Oscars, and they feared them. On this morning in January, Howard's mission had been simple: escort a formation of B-24 Liberators bombing Japanese supply depots near Yenangyaung. Simple, until the sky turned into a hornet's nest.
I never thought I'd miss the sound of those old
The attack came from the
propellers.
sun, as it always did. The Japanese understood geometry and violence. They understood that American bomber formations relied on mutual defense, that tight boxes of machine guns created overlapping fields of fire. So they did not attack the formation. They attacked the escorts. 37 fighters, Oscars and Zeros, dove from 28,000 feet in a coordinated strike designed to scatter the P-40s, to isolate them, to kill them one by one in the manner of wolves separating the weak from the herd. It worked. Within 90 seconds, Howard's squadron was shattered. Some pilots dove for the deck, seeking the marginal safety of treetop altitude. Others broke east, trying to run for the Chinese border. Howard's wingman took a 20-millimeter cannon shell through his cockpit and disappeared in a tumbling spiral of smoke. And then there was one. The rational choice was survival. One aircraft cannot fight 37. The mathematics of aerial combat are unforgiving. Energy states, turn rates, ammunition counts, every variable screamed the same message: run. The B-24s were on their own. The mission was lost. Howard could dive, could push his throttle to the firewall and head for the jungle, could live to fly another day. Every tactical manual, every instructor, every ounce of common sense pointed toward escape. James Howard turned into the enemy formation. What the Japanese pilots saw defied their understanding of American tactics. American pilots were supposed to be cautious, supposed to rely on technology and teamwork, supposed to retreat when outnumbered. This lone P-40, its shark-mouth nose art grinning like a death's head, came at them head-on. It was suicidal. It was insane. It was exactly what Howard was counting on. The P-40 Warhawk was not a dogfighter. It was heavy, sluggish in turns, built like a flying brick. But it had two qualities the Japanese fighters lacked. It could dive like a meteor, and it could take punishment that would shred a zero. Howard had learned something in his years over China, something the Navy instructors had never taught him, that air combat is not physics, it is psychology. Fear is a weapon, confusion is a weapon, and audacity, raw, insane audacity, can paralyze an enemy faster than any machine gun. He came in low and fast, pulling up beneath the bomber formation, weaving between the B-24s like a needle through cloth. The Japanese pilots, trained to attack isolated targets, found themselves suddenly defensive. This single aircraft was everywhere. It would flash across their gun sights, hammering out bursts of .50 caliber fire, then vanish into a dive before they could react. When they pursued, it would snap into a vertical climb that should have been aerodynamically impossible, stall at the apex, and come screaming back down on their tails. Howard was not fighting by the rules. He was not conserving ammunition, or maintaining formation discipline, or executing textbook maneuvers. He was improvising a ballet of violence, and the Japanese did not know how to respond. One Oscar made the mistake of committing to a turning fight. Howard let it pull inside his circle, let the Japanese pilot think he had the advantage, then snap-rolled and dove. The Oscar followed, and in that moment of pursuit, Howard did something no manual recommended. He chopped his throttle, extended his flaps, and hung his P-40 in the air like a hawk striking. The Oscar flashed past beneath him too fast to correct. Howard's gun spoke. 200 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition walked up the Oscar's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Japanese fighter came apart in a spray of aluminum and fire. The formation wavered. This was the trick that defied death. Not superior skill, not advanced technology, but the weaponization of unpredictability. The Japanese tactical doctrine was built on coordination, on predetermined attack patterns, on the assumption that numerical superiority would always prevail. Howard's chaos broke their rhythm. Every time they tried to organize a scissoring attack, he would break the geometry. Every time they set up a shot, he would accelerate or decelerate in ways that seemed to violate the laws of inertia. He flew like a man who had already died, and that made him impossible to kill. For 30 minutes, Howard fought alone against the swarm. His windscreen was spattered with oil. His own engine was hit, leaking, overheating. His right wing had a jagged tear from a 7.7mm round. His ammunition counters clicked down towards zero. But he did not leave. He could not leave. Below him, the B-24s droned on toward their target, their gunners watching in disbelief as this single fighter carved through the Japanese formation like a berserk angel. The bomber crews would later report that they stopped firing their own guns just to watch. It was not combat. It was performance. The Japanese expected Americans to fight with machines, not with madness. They expected discipline, hierarchy, the predictable responses of men trained in military academies. James Howard gave them something else. The fury of a man who had been told he wasn't good enough, who had been measured and found wanting, who had nothing to prove to anyone except the voice in his own head that whispered, "You are sufficient." The Navy had rejected him. The Japanese would remember him. By the time Howard's guns ran dry, 3 Japanese fighters were confirmed destroyed, 5 more were trailing smoke and limping back toward their bases, and the rest had broken off the attack. The bomber formation reached its target intact. Every crew member returned home. 0 American bombers were lost. The cost was 1 P-40 with a dying engine and a pilot whose hands would not stop shaking for 6 hours. Howard nursed his wounded aircraft back to base, gliding the final 10 miles with a dead engine, landing wheels up in a rice paddy that swallowed the Warhawk like quicksand. He climbed out, covered in hydraulic fluid, and his own blood from a cut he hadn't noticed, and sat on the wing until the rescue team found him. When they asked him why he didn't bail out, why he didn't run, he said something that the intelligence officers would write down and later classify. If I left, they'd have killed everyone. Someone had to stay. The bomber crews told a different story. They said Howard fought like a demon. They said he moved through the Japanese formation like smoke, like something not entirely human. One waist gunner, a 19-year-old from Ohio who had never seen combat before that day, would write in his diary, "I saw God today," and he was flying a P-40. The official records are dry, bureaucratic. The after-action report lists Howard's ammunition expenditure, his confirmed kills, the damage to his aircraft. It does not mention terror or beauty or the strange alchemy that happens when a man moves beyond fear into something purer. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor went through channels slowly, processed by committees who had to verify that yes, this impossible thing had actually happened. On January 17, 1944, exactly 1 year after the battle, President Franklin Roosevelt draped the pale blue ribbon around Howard's neck in a White House ceremony. The citation read, in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But the medal was not the point. The medal never is. James Howard returned to combat. He flew 60 missions over Europe, shot down 6 more enemy aircraft, survived the war, and retired as a brigadier general. He never spoke much about that day over Burma. When pressed, he would shrug and say, "I just did what needed doing." The Japanese pilots who survived wrote about it, though. In post-war interviews, several veterans of the Burma campaign mentioned the ghost shark that appeared from nowhere, that fought without fear, that could not be killed. One pilot, Yoshio Kodama, who had engaged Howard that day, said, "We thought Americans fought with radios and formations. This one fought with his spirit. We had no defense against that." There is a photograph from the Medal of Honor ceremony. Howard stands beside Roosevelt, both men in formal dress, the medal bright against Howard's dark uniform. If you look closely at Howard's face, you see something the newspapers missed. He is not smiling. His eyes are focused somewhere past the camera, past the reporters, past the marble columns of the White House. He is looking at a sky only he can see, where 37 enemies wait in the sun, where the jungle below holds no safe landing, where every second is a choice between terror and action. The Navy had called him unfit because they measured the wrong things. They measured his eyes and found them imperfect. They measured his reflexes and found them average. They never thought to measure his will. They never thought to measure what happens when a man is told he is not enough, when rejection becomes fuel, when the word no transforms into the launching point for something extraordinary. The bureaucrats who stamped his file saw liability. History saw something else. In the years after the war, aviation tacticians studied Howard's fight. They tried to break it down into components, into teachable moments, into doctrine. They failed. The maneuvers he executed should not have worked. The energy states were wrong. The mathematics did not support survival. On paper, James Howard died over Burma on January 17, 1943. But paper does not account for the human variable. Paper does not account for the moment when training ends and instinct begins, when fear burns away and clarity remains. The P-40 he flew that day was never recovered. It rests still in that Burmese rice paddy, slowly sinking into the mud, the shark teeth on its nose grinning at the sky. Local villagers say that sometimes, on January nights when the monsoon winds blow from the west, they hear the sound of a Allison V-1710 engine echoing through the hills, a ghost still flying, still fighting, still protecting bombers that reached home 60 years ago. There is a lesson here, though perhaps lesson is too clean a word for something written in fire and fear and 50 caliber tracers. The lesson is this, that rejection is not verdict, that the measurements others make of us are not the final accounting, that somewhere beyond the committees and the medical boards and the official denials, there exists a truth that can only be proven in action. James Howard was rejected because he did not fit the Navy's template. He became a hero because he did not need to. The Japanese pilots that day expected Americans to be what their intelligence briefings described: wealthy, soft, reliant on machines to do their fighting. They expected men who would run when the odds turned bad, who would calculate survival over duty. James Howard gave them something their briefings never mentioned: the pure, irrational courage of a man who had already been told no so many times that one more refusal, even from death itself, meant nothing. This is the arithmetic of freedom. Not that free men are better shots, or better pilots, or better tacticians, but that free men, truly free, unbound by the rigid hierarchies of honor culture and predetermined destiny, can improvise. They can adapt. They can look at 37 enemy fighters and see not an impossible situation, but a problem to be solved through audacity and violence and the kind of insane optimism that comes from being raised in a country that promises nothing except the right to try the symbolic object in. Howard's story is not a weapon or a medal. It is the cockpit stick, that simple column of metal and grips that translates human will into motion. In the hands of a pilot who follows the manual, it executes predetermined maneuvers. In the hands of a pilot who has been freed from expectation, who has nothing to prove and everything to give, it becomes something else: a conductor's baton orchestrating chaos, a painter's brush writing violence across the sky, a poet's pen turning physics into prophecy. Every American pilot who flew in World War II gripped such a stick, but only a few, only the ones like Howard, who had been broken and rejected and rebuilt, understood that the stick was not controlling the aircraft. It was controlling fear itself. Push forward, dive into danger. Pull back, climb toward uncertainty. Roll left or right. Choose which death to face first. The manual said these were mechanical inputs. Howard knew they were acts of will, made manifest. After the war, the United States Navy updated its medical fitness standards. The vision requirements were loosened. The reflexive testing was revised. The psychological evaluations were expanded to include factors beyond simple measurement. No official document ever stated why these changes were made, but everyone knew. They had rejected James Howard, and James Howard had won the Medal of Honor flying for a different branch. Bureaucracies do not admit mistakes, but they do update their procedures. Somewhere in those revised standards is an invisible addendum that reads, "Do not reject the men who might save everyone else." But by then, it was too late for Howard. He had already proven what needed proving. He had already flown into a sky where 37 enemies waited and emerged victorious, not because he was superior, but because he refused to accept the premise of impossibility. The Japanese fighters that day had every advantage: numbers, position, maneuverability, experience. They had everything except the one thing that mattered. They had never been rejected by their own side. They had never been told they were not good enough. They had never had to prove their worth against their own country's doubt. James Howard had, and that made all the difference. In the final accounting, the battle over Burma was a footnote. The strategic situation did not change. The Japanese continued their occupation. The Allies continued their grinding advance through the jungle. No territory changed hands because one man fought 37. But something else changed. Something that does not appear in the operational maps or the casualty figures. The bomber crews who watched Howard fight went on to fly 80 more missions. They faced flak and fighters and mechanical failures, and when the fear came, and the fear always came, they remembered the shark-mouth P-40 that would not die. They remembered that impossible things happen. They remembered that one man, properly motivated, can hold the line against anything. This is not mysticism. This is the documented psychological effect of witnessed heroism. The Army Air Forces studied it, quantified it, found that crews who had seen extraordinary acts of valor showed measurably higher survival rates in subsequent missions. Not because they flew better or fought harder, but because they believed survival was possible. James Howard's 30-minute fight saved 19 bombers that day. But it also saved crews who flew months later, who faced their own impossible odds and remembered, if he could do that, we can do this. The rejected pilot, the maverick, the man who fought alone against the swarm and won through audacity rather than firepower. This is an American archetype, repeated endlessly in our mythology because it reflects something true about the national character. Americans are not born believing in their own exceptionalism. They are rejected into it. The Puritans were rejected by England. The revolutionaries were rejected by the Crown. The pioneers were rejected by settled society. Every American hero story is a story of someone told no by the authorities, who then proceeds to prove the authorities catastrophically wrong. James Howard is that story distilled to its essence and written in contrails. The Navy said no. He found another way. The enemy said die. He found another way. The mathematics of combat said you cannot fight 37 with one. He found another way. This is the trick that defies death. Not superior technology, not overwhelming force, but the absolute refusal to accept the limitations that others try to impose. As the sun set over Burma on January 17, 1943, the surviving Japanese pilots landed at their bases and filed their reports. They described the American formation, the disposition of bombers, the weather conditions. And then, reluctantly, they described the lone fighter that had shattered their attack. Their commanders did not believe them. 37 against 1, and the one had won. Impossible. The reports were flagged as exaggeration, as combat stress, as the fevered imaginings of pilots who had failed their mission. It was only later, when the pattern repeated, when other American pilots began adopting Howard's tactics, when the rigid Japanese formations began to crumble against improvised American aggression, that the truth became undeniable. The Americans did not fight like samurai. They fought like jazz musicians, improvising, riffing, turning structure into suggestion and suggestion into victory. James Howard was the soloist who played the first impossible riff, and once the enemy heard it, they could never unhear it. From that day forward, every Japanese pilot who engaged Americans in the Burma theater had to consider, what if this one is another Howard? What if this one does not run? That doubt was a weapon more powerful than any machine gun. 70 years after the battle, historians discovered Japanese records that had been sealed since the war. Among them were personal diaries of pilots who fought in the Burma campaign. One entry, dated January 18, 1943, the day after Howard's fight, reads, "We are told that Americans are weak, that they love life too much to die for their cause. Yesterday, I watched one American choose certain death rather than abandon his duty. If they are all like this, we will lose this war." The pilot who wrote that entry survived until 1945, when he died in a kamikaze attack off Okinawa. His final act was to fly his aircraft into an American destroyer in a last desperate attempt to stop the inevitable. He died with honor, following orders, executing the ultimate sacrifice demanded by his code. But his diary suggests he understood, in those final moments, that there was another kind of courage, the courage to live impossibly rather than die predictably, to fight not because death is glorious, but because survival is necessary, to reject the script written by fate and improvise something better. James Howard flew that courage. He embodied it. He proved that the rejected, the dismissed, the men told they are not sufficient, can become the very definition of sufficiency. His trick was not a trick at all. It was a truth that freedom, real freedom, is the ability to look at 37 enemies and see not an ending, but a problem to be solved through will and violence, and the bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. The sky over Burma is quiet now. The P-40s and Oscars are gone, replaced by commercial jets following GPS-guided routes. The rice paddy where Howard landed has been built over, a highway cutting through what was once jungle. The men who fought that day are dead, the last of them passing in the early 2000s, taking with them the sensory memories, the smell of burning oil, the sound of an Allison engine at full throttle, the taste of fear sharp as copper in the mouth, but the story remains. It remains because it is true, and because truth has a weight that fiction cannot match. Somewhere in a military archive, there is a gun camera film from that day. Grainy black and white footage showing tracers arcing through the sky. A lone P-40 weaving through a forest of enemy fighters. Impossible physics made manifest. Historians study that footage, trying to extract lessons. Pilots watch it and feel something primal, recognition perhaps, or longing for the days when valor was measured in seconds of action rather than years of service. James Howard, rejected pilot, Medal of Honor recipient, died in 1995 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by bomber crews who owed him their lives, by pilots who learned tactics from his example, by children and grandchildren who would never fully understand what he had done, but who carried his name forward nonetheless. He was buried with full military honors. The Navy sent a color guard, the same Navy that had rejected him 54 years earlier. No one commented on the irony. Everyone understood it. This is the epilogue written in sky and memory, that American strength is not born from perfection, but from the refusal to accept imperfection as disqualification. James Howard was not the best pilot. He was not the fastest or the most accurate or the most decorated. He was simply the one who stayed when staying meant dying, who fought when fighting meant losing, who looked at impossible odds and decided that impossible was merely a suggestion. That is the ideology the Axis powers could never defeat. Not capitalism or democracy or industrial might, though those helped. But this, the bone-deep American belief that the answer to "you cannot" is always "watch me." James Howard embodied that belief for 30 minutes over Burma, and in doing so, he wrote a chapter in the book of human possibility that can never be erased. The rejected pilot saved everyone. And in saving them, he proved that rejection is not an ending. It is a beginning, the beginning of the story where the dismissed become indispensable, where the weak become strong, where one man against 37 becomes the definition not of suicide, but of victory. The trick that defied death was no trick at all. It was freedom flying.